Good afternoon, everyone. I think you would probably all agree that was a wonderful lunch. Congratulations to whoever picked that menu. Was that you, Rajul? Katarla. So I'm very pleased to, my name's Paul Dorosh. I'm the Director of the Development Strategy and Governance Division. And I'm very pleased to be able to introduce to you Dr. Homi Kharas. He's our keynote speaker today. And Homi is the Interim Vice President and Director of the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution here in Washington, D.C. He's published widely on development policy, global governance, and other global issues. Authored and co-edited several books, including The Imperative of Development, The Last Mile in Ending Extreme Poverty, Getting to Scale, How to Bring Development Solutions to Millions of Poor People, and many other publications. Prior to joining Brookings, Dr. Kharas spent 26 years at the World Bank, serving for 7 years as chief economist for the World Bank's East Asia and Pacific region, and director for poverty reduction and economic management, as well as finance and private sector development. Homi has a PhD in economics from Harvard University and a BA in economics from Cambridge University. And we would just like to welcome Homi to IFPRI.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks all of you for coming. It's great to be back here, great to be talking to you. And I was asked to say some words about how the development agenda is evolving. It'll come up behind me? Okay. The title is kind of important, you know, because otherwise you won't really know what it is I'm going to talk about. But there we go. The point I wanted to make is that, you know, the development agenda, this is a big, broad thing. So I was trying to think about exactly what it is that I really wanted to emphasize today. And so I thought that I would start by showing you what we think is happening, we meaning we at Brookings, think is happening on the progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. So I've just been doing some work with a couple of colleagues at Brookings. We took all of the indicators, the quantitative indicators that we could find. We did some trajectory simulations, and basically on the left-hand side you see for the various different indicators the percent of people that we think will more or less be in places which meet the target, and then the percent of people who are in places that don't meet the target. And what you will see is that other than 3 indicators, we are way off, less than 50% of the way there on all others. If you pull out the ones that are more specifically related to food and nutrition security, which are the ones on the right-hand side of this chart, you'll see that this is particularly bad, and some indicators like obesity are actually moving in the wrong direction. The point I want to make is that things are not good for the development agenda. And it's not because we don't have thoughts and ideas about what to do, but somehow the big questions are about how do we actually take these, translate them into action, and importantly, translate them into action at scale. So what does that mean? So the development agenda has come up with a whole bunch of phrases, I would say. So now You'll hear lots of talk about inclusive growth. You'll hear talk about sustainable growth. In order to achieve these goals, we have to have accelerated growth. And also, I would say, some evolving thinking about the instruments that we really use and pay attention to. So very few people now are really talking about aid as the principal instrument for development, maybe as a catalyst. But if you really want to reach scale, people are more and more talking about using market-based solutions, market-based financing. It could be market-based financing coming from public financial institutions, but it's not concessional. I think there's much more now emphasis on evidence and results, partly because data is so much easier to come by and manipulate. There's a lot of discussion, and I want to come back to this, about policy coherence, because it turns out that none of the things that we're really interested in as development outcomes can be achieved on their own and in a single sector. And one of the things that I hope we can talk about afterwards is, how does that really relate to food and nutrition security? What are the things outside of the things you normally look at that are relevant and pertinent to achieving those outcomes? There's much more emphasis today on technology, both digital technologies, but also technology more broadly in the sort of the real economy sense. And one of the things I want to throw out to you as an idea is that when we talk about things like smallholder agriculture, I think you would see it as being the intersection of every one of these things. So if you think about what do we mean by inclusive growth in a world where we still have 3+ billion people in rural areas, we still have 500 million small farms, etc. What does the inclusive part mean? It means smallholder agriculture. If we want to talk about sustainable growth in the sense of environmental sustainability, a lot has to do with agricultural practices, pasture management, grazing, husbandry, those kinds of issues. If we want to talk about how growth is going to accelerate in most low-income countries, it will not accelerate, and I'll come back to this, if it's not based on some kind of accelerated performance in agriculture. So I would say that smallholder agriculture is actually right in the center. And obviously, market-based solutions, I mean, that's smallholder agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. So I want you to keep that in mind. I worry that we don't actually know what is going on in food and nutrition security. And I've thrown up here 4 different indicators, and they're all moving in different directions. And it is, you know, before we even get into the idea of research and analysis and things like that, I think we should have a far better understanding of what is the basic data actually showing us. And so even today, well, just now, Sophie was just released. You see the undernourishment line, that's sort of that flat line in purple. I didn't have time to update it, but there's a slight upwards tick. It's basically flat in terms of the share of the global population. So, you know, that line basically says, okay, over 20 years, we've had no progress. It's all pretty much flat. It should be the case, I think, that things like hunger, undernourishment, etc., should be somewhat related to extreme poverty. But if you look at the extreme poverty line, it's behaving in a completely different way. So that's the green line, which is coming down. That's much more consistent with the data that we have on stunting, which is just above that, which is also coming down, but at a somewhat slower rate. And then you have these things like the Gallup World Poll, which asks people questions about whether or not they have enough money to buy food. And you see what's happening to that's moving in exactly the other direction. So I think we have just right from the start, a big fundamental problem of understanding what is going on in the world with food and nutrition security, and understanding whether this is the result of poor quality data, or whether this is the result of data which is actually accurate but measuring different aspects of food and nutrition security, in which case we might need to change the way in which we think about FNS. Excuse me. So I thought I would try to break down the research challenges into a few big blocks. And actually, Paul. Sorry about that. So, and at the end I want to come back to, sort of trying to have a conversation about what kinds of things are worthy of additional study, and then how do we actually go about getting from research and evidence into policy action. But the first thing I wanted to do is to say there are a bunch of things around just basic technology. We kind of know that we've got a major problem with low yields in sub-Saharan Africa. And we're not going to make much progress on food and nutrition security if we don't do something about these yields. It's not rocket science. It's not something that is not well known to all of you. But there's a big fundamental question. These yields are low, and they haven't really grown over now close to a 30-year period. Why? Well, one possible answer is on the right-hand side panel, which is fertilizer, but you can talk about fertilizer, you can talk about water, you can talk about improved seeds, a whole range of different things. But there are a series of issues basically on the technology of how do we get yields up much faster, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. If we don't do that, and if we don't do that quite rapidly, there is no chance for achieving the food and nutrition security goals that have been set out under the SDGs. So I think this is a major issue for research and understanding about what is it exactly that is blocking the effort to increase those kinds of yields. And essentially what you see is that not only are yields lower than in every other region, but they've also been growing much less rapidly. Second, policy coherence. For a very short period of time, I actually thought that the world was moving towards a better global policy on agriculture and agricultural trade. That seems to have disappeared. So the left-hand side shows you OECD subsidies and China subsidies to producers. And so, OECD subsidies were actually moving downwards. That was a good thing. Then you see that in China, it's moving in exactly the opposite direction. You put the two of those together, and you're back to 400 to 500 billion dollars per year. Absolutely massive, and exactly the same size as it was 30 years ago. It's just that the distribution and allocation has shifted. So we've got huge global subsidies. We're not making progress in actually getting greater efficiencies into the global food system. And when you look at it country by country, and I think that this database, which is up in the OECD, is something that IFPRI contributes to, if not actually does. You see these nominal rates of protection in agriculture just starting to shoot up. So, to me, the research question here is why? you know, what on earth has happened? We just had, I thought, made some progress in getting people to understand that that was not the way to go about things. And then there's been this big reversal. And we've moved in exactly the opposite direction, and by a large and substantial amount. So policy coherence, I think, is something important, and somehow we've lost the ability to connect what we think is useful at the global level with the way in which politicians and policymakers think they need to move at the domestic level. And so understanding that political economy between those two seems to be important. Third, similarly, there's a political economy issue. So the left-hand chart here shows you the real price of food, cereals, as an index plotted against ODA for food and nutrition security. And guess what? They follow each other exactly. We did a report, I don't know, 3-4 years ago saying, you know, we have to be very careful. Food prices have gone up. This was around, 2012. Food prices have gone up. Everybody's paying attention. There's this new kind of, boost for FNS aid. But in the past, whenever food prices come back down, aid collapses. And this time, we shouldn't let that happen. Well, guess what? Food prices did collapse, and this time, yet again, we let it happen. We can't solve these kinds of issues if you have this kind of volatility in financing. And this is volatility in the aggregate level. When you go to what happens at the individual country level, of course, the volatility gets accentuated. So we've got a real problem with somehow trying to persuade people that we have a long-term problem that requires a long-term solution with long-term stable funding sources. And why is that? Well, this group, Aid Data, went off and they asked people, which of the SDGs are your real priorities? We all know it's a package and this, that, and the other, but come on, we also really know that there is always some prioritization. Look at where goal 2 on zero hunger comes, fourth from the bottom. So one big problem is that while there are a lot of people who actually believe that hunger, food, and nutrition security is the major poverty issue of the day, policymakers and leaders in their own countries don't think this. They think about education, peace and justice, decent work and economic growth, and so on and so forth. How do we get, what is the political economy of raising this in terms of its priority on the global agenda in individual countries? We cannot take that for granted as something that will automatically happen because we observe human suffering on such a massive scale. That doesn't seem to be enough to do the job. And then fourth, I wanted to say there's something now where people start to talk about so-called systems thinking. We can't think about food and nutrition security any longer as just being, which we never did, as just being about agriculture or something else. But it's now embedded in these much broader systems. And as just one example of that, I wanted to highlight the links between this agenda and the climate change agenda. So we all know that something on the order of 20 to 25% of global carbon emissions are coming out of the agriculture, animal husbandry type of sector. But if you look at how much of the money for climate mitigation is going into those kinds of projects? The answer is 8%, something like that. I mean, it's tiny. So it's like, why is this? And, you know, people like McKinsey have done these cost effectiveness kinds of calculations, and you always find that the pasture, soil management, all of these kinds of things emerge as being far more effective than the solar cells and wind power and all the other things that the money for climate mitigation is going into. There hasn't been this linkage across sectors. And I'm just giving here one example, which is the example of climate change, but there are lots of other examples, I think, into different sectors. So a real critical question, I think, is when we think about this, what is the system? By which I mean, who are the people that we want to bring into thinking about these things, because they're connected and they have resources and other assets that they can bring to bear on the problem. And so that could be, it could be firms and companies, it could be other sectors, it could be consumers, it could be a range of different things. But we have to think about, what is this market system? Remember at the beginning I talked about market-based solutions. What is this market system? How do we define it? And who are the actors who we need to engage? So where next? Here are my four things. So there's a whole bunch of research. I want to talk on this just about the what. What kind of research would be valuable? A whole bunch of research on technologies we all know about: seeds, drought, heat tolerance, water harvesting, nitrogen use. I've got one thing there, which is Mars bars. So the Mars Corporation is producing a new low-cost nutrition bar that they claim will revolutionize nutrition in Africa. No problems with cold storage, massive nutrition, 10 cents per bar, so they brought the price point down. They think it's the equivalent of, you know, whatever, a glass of milk for every school kid kind of thing. Schengen was just telling me about the Impossible Burger that all of you had for lunch yesterday, that is going to be a real breakthrough in, you know, the nutrition. So there are technological solutions, potentially, that are out there. And thinking about the research that goes into this, I think, is something which is really important. But of course, we shouldn't think that technology is going to solve all of our problems. The idea of systems thinking. We talked a lot on the production side, obviously in the system. As you think about the system, you think about it from, you know, farm to not just a consumer, but also to the post-consumer, because there's an awful lot of food waste, which is, you know, after it goes into that. We know so little about that. I mean, the metrics on food loss and food waste are really quite poor. Definitions are quite poor. People toss around these numbers of, you know, something like a third might be lost in this chain. It obviously depends enormously about what you're talking about. It's different for tomatoes than it is for cereals. But nevertheless, a third is a big enough number that you could do an awful lot to improve things without having to actually increase the amount of production. I think as soon as you get into systems thinking, you have to start to think about what is the role of business, and business both on the producing side but also on the demand side, and the role of supermarkets, the way in which, you know, people hook into value chains. There's a lot being written now on these, you know, not even talking about urban and rural-urban linkages, but actually thinking much more about a system where you have a geographic area which connects a market, especially with small towns. There's a consortium called FABLE, Food, Agriculture, Biodiversity, Land, something else, etc., which is trying to do more modeling work and systems work on food and nutrition security. Then a bunch of potential research on the political economy. So here I just thought I would put up, we talk about these things at the G20, and now you have meetings of the chief scientists of G20 countries, of the agriculture ministers. There's the Malabo Declaration in Africa. You had GAFSP. You've got a lot of countries that are actually talking about food and agriculture in their voluntary national reviews that people submit to the thing. So if we have all of these things, how come we have had no improvement in any of the development outcomes that I was talking about at the beginning? Somehow, in the political economy thinking that we're doing, the kinds of things that we're mobilizing action around aren't generating real outcomes. So I think we need to think about, so what is it that we need to do at the international level? These kinds of general meetings aren't doing the trick. Some of them are just collapsing under their own, I mean, you know, GAFSP seems to be collapsing under the weight of loss of funding, etc. But others, I mean, the Malabo Declaration, countries voluntarily made these pledges and then just systematically ignored them. And there's a whole political economy of how giving people the opportunity to make a pledge allows them to feel that they're doing something, but it's just an excuse for doing nothing. So we're kind of enabling bad behavior. So I think that we do need to think a little bit more about exactly what are the kinds of things that will generate pre-commitments in a much more tangible way. And then finally, I think there's some now really interesting work that is starting to happen around the role of safety nets and whether safety nets in and of themselves can be a solution. So to some extent, if you were to just make sure that this is the poverty versus undernourishment thing, imagine that we could solve poverty by extending safety nets everywhere. And right now, we have safety nets with reasonable coverage in most developing countries, including most low-income countries. If you could fill that, would that solve the problem? Would that solve a lot of the problems that we're talking about? Would demand simply create its own supply? I think that's it's a really interesting research question about whether we've put the right weight and balance on supply versus demand. So then last, let me just say a couple of words about something that concerns us, all of us in the research community, and especially us at Brookings. And that's around how do we actually get any of the research that we do into the policymakers' making sphere. I mean, there's a lot of data. There are a lot of evaluations that we do. It's really difficult to get anybody to take this seriously, and it's very difficult to get them to use that evidence to actually scale up their own programs. We tend to respond to that by doubling down and investing even more in data and evaluations and systems. And this has now become a big, expensive, fragmented endeavor. And now it's big enough that it's actually taking real resources away from just getting on and doing the job. And so you've got to start to ask these questions about, you know, if research, I mean, the whole idea of research is to be catalytic and to be a relatively cheap way of getting to scale with good things. It's not about taking money away from the programs that will allow you to get to scale. So some people have tried to look at how people use research, and what they conclude, and this again comes from, I think from an aid data or a development gateway report. Sorry, I forget exactly which, but it's fairly commonsensical. I mean, it's the idea that you should try to provide the data that people actually can use and information that people can use. It's the idea that you have to be much more specific about actionable recommendations at the end of your research. It's the idea that it's not good enough to just go to the policymakers, if you will. You have to build a whole ecosystem so that there is demand for policymakers to actually act. That means you've got to take the results of your work to potential beneficiaries so that they can be advocates for saying, well, why isn't this happening here if it's happening elsewhere with such good effect? And really trying to stimulate the demand for action based on successful interventions from elsewhere. And to get to beneficiaries, usually a report is not the medium of choice. You're not going to get many people to actually read this stuff. You have to use very, very different types of communication. And then finally, I think there's a real how-to at the end of the day is engaging with a lot of the people in businesses who ultimately manage the value chains that we're talking about, the R&D that we're talking about, the new technological breakthroughs that we're talking about, who understand the price points that need to happen if one's really going to be able to take these things to scale, and that have, in some cases, the reach, either through their distributors or through their suppliers, to be able to take research results really into scale. And there, of course, the great tension for researchers is that research is a public good, and everything that business does is a private good, and there are obvious conflicts between them. So let me just close there with saying that, both the what we should do in terms of research as well as the how we go about it, I think are, opening up in terms of how we go about our business. And the good news, I think, is that there's now just so much more access to data, access to evidence, ability to do research, and counterparts on the other side who are able to absorb some of this information. Thank you.